June 1944. Hauptmann Heinrich Richter, a veteran of the Eastern Front, felt the familiar dread coil in his stomach. But this was different. This was the West, the vaunted Atlantic Wall, the home turf where Germany had promised absolute security. His men, dug into positions overlooking the invasion beaches, were nervous. They'd heard the rumors, seen the aerial reconnaissance photos. But the High Command remained confident. This was a sideshow, they claimed, a feint before the real invasion. The Anglo-Americans, they muttered in the mess halls, lacked the stomach for a true fight. They were soft. They'd break. That initial arrogance, a bitter inheritance from years of easy victories, was the first casualty of the morning of June 6th. The sky, once a canvas for Luftwaffe triumphs, became a swirling maelstrom of Allied aircraft, a relentless metal storm. The naval bombardment that followed was beyond anything Heinrich had ever witnessed, even on the Russian steppe. Kilometer after kilometer of coastline simply ceased to exist, pulverized into dust and screaming shrapnel. "They are wasting their ammunition," a young lieutenant had nervously quipped, trying to sound brave, but his voice was thin, reedy, lost in the earth-shattering percussion. They thought they knew war. They were about to learn they knew nothing. The paratroopers descended, silent ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness, followed by the monstrous landings. Waves of men, tanks, and vehicles poured onto the beaches. Still, the initial reports were laced with a defiant optimism. "Local penetrations contained," the radio crackled, "enemy forces suffering heavy casualties." German propaganda, even at the front, clung to the narrative of a weak, disorganized foe. Heinrich saw it differently. He saw the sheer, terrifying scale. He saw the resilience of men fighting their way off beaches that should have been impregnable. He thought they could hold them, perhaps even push them back. He was wrong. The days that followed D-Day became a brutal, grinding tutorial in the true nature of the Western Allies. German panzer divisions, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, found themselves struggling to even reach the front. Every road, every bridge, every open field was under the merciless gaze of Allied air power. Tanks moved only at night, hidden beneath camouflage nets during the day, crews sweating inside their steel coffins as the distant thrum of engines announced another strafing run. Fuel convoys burst into flame. Supply lines were severed. "The sky belongs to them," a despairing panzer commander radioed, his voice ragged with exhaustion. The boastful confidence of the first day began to curdle into a bitter confusion. How could an army fight without air cover, without the ability to move freely? The Allied beachhead, far from being contained, expanded with a slow, inexorable dread. Towns like Carentan and Bayeux fell. Caen, a vital strategic objective, became a bloody, bombed-out ruin as the British and Canadian forces hammered at its defenses, day after relentless day. German counterattacks, once feared, were now piecemeal, under strength, and invariably shattered by artillery barrages and overwhelming air support. The soft Anglo-Americans fought with a cold, methodical efficiency, accepting casualties, always pushing, always building. Engineers worked tirelessly, constructing airfields from scratch in a matter of days, assembling the prefabricated harbor at Mulberry. It wasn't just an invasion, it was an industrial marvel, a logistical nightmare for the defenders. The enemy wasn't just fighting, they were moving an entire continent across a channel. The relentless attrition began to gnaw at the very soul of the German army in Normandy. The fabled Bocage country, with its sunken lanes and ancient hedgerows, became a meat grinder, a claustrophobic hellscape where every hedge could conceal a hidden machine gun nest or a lurking Sherman. Casualties mounted, but replacements were few and often poorly trained. The men, once proud and confident, became gaunt, their eyes reflecting the constant exhaustion, the unending terror of the P-47s and Typhoons. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, raged at the impossibility of the situation. "The front is everywhere," he exclaimed, "but nowhere do we have a reserve." His words echoed the growing despair amongst the officers, who now understood they were not merely fighting a battle, but bleeding themselves to death in a war of resources they could never win. By late June, the strategic picture was catastrophic. Cherbourg, a vital port, fell to the Americans after a brutal siege, securing a deep-water harbor for the seemingly endless stream of Allied supplies. The beachhead, initially a tenuous toehold, was now a sprawling, unassailable fortress, churning out men and materiel at an alarming rate. Germany's panzer divisions were mere shadows of their former selves, ground down by weeks of constant combat, their tanks destroyed, their crews decimated. There was no breakthrough, there was no decisive counterattack. There was only the slow, sickening realization that the Western Front, once considered a quiet sector, was now a drain that would consume the last of the Reich's dwindling strength. On the 1st of July, 1944, a phone call would seal the fate of a nation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander West, an old warrior whose mind was as sharp as ever, was on the line with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW, Hitler's rubber stamp. Keitel, ever the sycophant, asked the question that still rings with an almost tragic absurdity. "What should we do?" The answer was not a tactical suggestion, not a request for reinforcements, but a howl of pure, unadulterated despair, born of weeks watching the inevitable unfold. "Make peace, you fools!" Von Rundstedt's words, so stark, so utterly without hope, ripped through the last vestiges of German delusion. He saw what Hitler and his acolytes refused to acknowledge: that Germany was fighting an unwinnable war on too many fronts, against an enemy whose industrial might and logistical prowess were simply insurmountable. He saw the endless production lines, the inexhaustible manpower of the Allies, arrayed against a Reich that was bleeding dry. His blunt, damning assessment cost him his command, but it was a truth he could no longer keep silent. The soft enemy had become a terrifying, unstoppable juggernaut, and the German army, once the terror of Europe, was now facing its own, very certain doom. His words were a desperate plea, a final, horrifying prophecy that would soon engulf the entire Reich in fire and ruin.